A quiet dinner was supposed to celebrate unity, but ended up tearing open old royal wounds. The grandeur of the coronation had barely settled, its echoes still bouncing off the palace walls. Cameras had captured the ceremony, the crowns, the waves, but not this. Not the moment that truly unraveled the illusion of harmony. Behind closed doors, in a room lit by tradition more than warmth, a private dinner took place. It was just three of them: King Charles, Queen Camilla, and Princess Anne. What was meant to be a simple gathering of family turned into something far more volatile. It began quietly, with the clinking of cutlery and faint murmurs of ceremonial exhaustion. But tension sat at the table like a fourth guest. It wasn't loud. It didn't shout. It lingered. Camilla, perhaps emboldened by the success of the grand event, or finally feeling the full weight of her new title, let the word slip with casual grace. As queen, It wasn't said with arrogance. Maybe it wasn't even meant to provoke. But to Anne, it felt like a thunderclap in a silent chapel. A word so loaded, so heavy with history and defiance, it shattered the air. Anne's reaction wasn't explosive. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture, just the sound of her fork quietly resting on her plate, and a glance sharp enough to pierce centuries of royal decorum. Her voice came calm but cold, cutting with the precision of a blade. "You are the king's wife." 5 words. Nothing more. But they landed with the force of a dynasty behind them. Charles, newly crowned and already worn by the burdens that come with it, froze. His hands didn't move. His breath stalled. In that pause, the unspoken truth lay bare. He understood. He knew Anne well enough to know those words had lived inside her long before they were spoken. She hadn't come to the dinner looking for confrontation, but she hadn't come to sit silently either. For Anne, that word queen wasn't a matter of semantics. It was a matter of principle, of legacy, of their mother's solemn vow to the nation. And in that moment, what Camilla saw was not just a sister-in-law's disapproval. It was the full weight of royal history staring back at her with judgment. Camilla's eyes turned to Charles, silently pleading for support. But he offered none, not because he agreed or disagreed, but because he knew better than to argue with the truth Anne had just spoken. The room went still. What was said next is lost to silence. But what lingered was a wound freshly reopened. Not by malice, not by rage, but by remembrance. The kind of memory that doesn't fade, no matter how many jewels you wear or ceremonies you survive. But what drove Anne to speak out so coldly in that moment? The answer lies deep within royal history. She never needed a crown to command respect, because legacy was already in her blood. From the moment she took her first breath within the royal fold, Princess Anne was destined to carry the weight of duty with a poise few could match. Not through glamour, not through scandal, not even through title, but through relentless, silent service. While others sought the limelight, Anne walked straight past it, eyes fixed on responsibility. She wasn't bred for applause. She was forged for endurance. While the monarchy wavered in public favor during storms of controversy, she stood unshaken always where the crown needed her, never asking for more. Decades passed, and with each year, the British people began to see something different in her. Not just a daughter of a queen, but the image of what a queen could have been, if only tradition had allowed. Anne never complained. Not once. She knew from an early age that as a woman in a male-preferred line of succession, the throne would never be hers. But she didn't let that become her weakness. It became her strength. She didn't need a crown to show the world who she was. Every ribbon cut, every medal ceremony attended, every weary handshake offered without fail, these were her battles. And the people noticed. In their eyes, she became the queen that never was. Quietly dignified, consistently loyal. Her duty wasn't performative. It was instinctive. Her version of royalty was laced with discipline and a steely restraint that came not from protocol, but from pride in service. And therein lies the contrast that fueled an unspoken rift. Camilla's journey to the top had been fast-tracked through love, scandal, and public relations. She went from the shadows of infamy to the grand stage of coronation in a matter of decades. But Anne had been there all along. She didn't arrive. She endured. The very fabric of her existence was stitched with sacrifice, discipline, and a fierce devotion to the monarchy. And when she stood beside her brother at the coronation, watching Camilla be crowned with the title their late mother had so carefully measured, something in her stirred not envy, but alarm. For Anne, this wasn't just a title shift. It was the erosion of a promise the one their mother had made to the people when she declared Camilla would be queen consort, not queen. That distinction, to many, may seem symbolic. But to Anne, it was sacred. A line drawn not in ceremony, but in trust. And when that line was crossed, the image of her mother's legacy cracked. It wasn't just about Camilla. It was about the monarchy's moral compass veering off course, and Anne, always the steady hand, couldn't stand by silently anymore. That moral compass clashed violently with something Anne could never accept: Camilla's new title. One word changed the room, and that word was queen. It slipped out quietly, without fanfare, almost unnoticed at first, until it wasn't. As queen, Camilla had said, mid-sentence, as though the title had always been hers. But for Princess Anne, that word didn't just echo, it detonated. In that charged silence, time seemed to bend. 1,000 unsaid things rushed in, colliding with decades of protocol, memory, and grief. Anne, who had spent her life living in the rigid shadow of royal restraint, had long tolerated the shifts within the family with iron composure. But this wasn't a minor slip. This wasn't forgivable. It was a rewriting of legacy spoken aloud in front of the one woman who had pledged her life to preserve it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. Instead, she laid down her fork with precision, her gaze locking with Camilla's in a manner that needed no interpretation. Then came the words, slow and deliberate, delivered not in fury, but in finality. You are the king's wife. Nothing more, nothing less, and everything in between. 5 words, stripped of affection, stripped of ambiguity. The chill in the air wasn't from disapproval. It was from truth laid bare. And in that moment, it was as if the table tilted, and the balance of silence and civility tipped irreversibly. Camilla didn't respond immediately. She couldn't. Her lips parted slightly, but no words followed. Her eyes flicked to Charles, desperate, pleading, needing him to break the tension. But he didn't move. He didn't speak. And that silence was more revealing than anything else. Because Charles knew Anne. He knew the weight behind her words. He knew they weren't born out of jealousy or spite. They came from a place deeper than anger. They came from a place of inherited duty and broken promises. He had witnessed this kind of fire in her before, in moments where family and monarchy collided, and he understood that when Anne spoke, it wasn't impulsive, it was necessary. What stunned Camilla wasn't just the correction, it was what it implied. That even after all these years, after surviving scrutiny, after stepping into the most powerful female position in the land, someone within the family still didn't accept her. Not as queen, not truly, and not quietly. That one word, spoken so innocently, had become a landmine she didn't know she'd stepped on until it was too late. And Anne? Anne had been holding her breath for too long. That dinner was never going to pass in peace, not after the coronation, not after the title was cemented in gold and announced to the world, because Anne wasn't challenging Camilla's rise. She was challenging the rewriting of royal history, and that confrontation didn't erupt. It unfolded, slowly and purposefully, because Anne had chosen her moment with calculated precision. The coronation had closed one chapter, but with that, single word, queen. Camilla had unknowingly opened another. But this clash wasn't just about titles, it was about promises made long ago. Before she passed, Queen Elizabeth made a promise to the people, and Anne never forgot it. It wasn't just a carefully worded statement. It was a vow. In February 2022, on the 70th anniversary of her reign, Queen Elizabeth publicly declared her wish that Camilla, when the time came, would be known as Queen Consort. Those two words, soft in sound but sharp in significance, weren't chosen lightly. They were a bridge designed to cross decades of controversy, resentment, and national grief. The Queen had lived through the chaos of Diana's death. She'd watched her family torn apart under scrutiny, and she had spent years cautiously rebuilding the public's faith in the institution. To her, naming Camilla Queen Consort was a compromise between duty and reality. Not an elevation, but a containment. Anne, more than anyone, understood what that meant. She knew her mother's tone, the weight behind every public word. Queen Consort wasn't a courtesy, it was a limit. It was the Crown's way of saying, we recognize her role, but we won't forget the past. Because behind that polished title lay a history soaked in heartache. The disintegration of Charles and Diana, the pain endured by the monarchy, and the wounds never fully healed in the eyes of the public. Anne had stood by as those events unfolded, never publicly intervening, never seeking the spotlight, but always absorbing the damage. And when her mother made that declaration, Anne felt it as an oath not just to the crown, but to history itself. But in the coronation's aftermath, everything had changed. The word consort disappeared. Official palace communications, media headlines, and even Charles's own acknowledgments referred to Camilla as the Queen. Not Queen Consort, just Queen. To most, it seemed ceremonial. To Anne, it was betrayal. A slow erasure of boundaries her mother had drawn with such precision. The same boundaries that had preserved the monarchy's integrity when it teetered on the edge. Anne saw it not as a rebranding, but as a rewriting of truth. A public revision of promises that were never meant to be undone. What cut even deeper was the silence surrounding it. No explanation, no clarification. The institution that prided itself on tradition had suddenly become fluid with language, flexible with legacy. And for Anne, that silence screamed. Because this wasn't just about protocol, it was about personal devotion. Anne had modeled herself after her mother, not just in conduct, but in conviction. To her, upholding Queen Elizabeth's word wasn't optional. It was sacred. And watching that promise dissolve under the weight of modern convenience felt like a rupture between what the monarchy was and what it was becoming. And yet, the public saw something different. Many accepted Camilla's new title without resistance. After years of quiet appearances, charitable engagements, and avoidance of controversy, she had softened her image. The people had moved on, or so it seemed. But within the palace, the contrast between public perception and private discontent had never been sharper. Anne didn't protest in the open. She didn't rally the media, but her silence turned into that icy correction at dinner, the moment she refused to let one word erase decades of meaning. But Anne's outburst wasn't just royal loyalty, it was personal. Anne never forgot who Camilla used to be, because neither did the public. Long before the titles, before the grand gowns and the silent waves from palace balconies, Camilla was something else. She was the woman in the background. The one whispered about in tabloid headlines, the one Princess Diana called the third person in her marriage. For decades, Camilla existed in the shadows, never fully accepted, never fully condemned. But she was always there. To the public, she wasn't just a mistress. She was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in the fairy tale. And for Anne, who had watched that fairy tale unravel up close, that memory wasn't something she could simply discard for the sake of royal rebranding. Camilla's rise wasn't meteoric, it was methodical. Slowly, deliberately, she re-entered royal circles. Her presence reshaped through carefully chosen causes and public restraint. Over the years, the scandal gave way to acceptance. She became the face of endurance, of quiet rehabilitation. And yet, no matter how much time passed, the stain of the past never fully faded. Diana's name still lingered in every discussion, in every ceremony, in every hesitant comparison. The British public had learned to forgive, but they had not forgotten. Neither had Anne. She may have tolerated Camilla's presence, even played the part of a cordial royal sister-in-law, but she never embraced the transformation. Because to her, Camilla wasn't just the woman Charles loved. She was the fracture in a sacred vow. And now, seeing her wear the title that once would have belonged to Diana, Anne's tolerance wore thin. It wasn't jealousy, it was principle. Diana's tragedy had become part of the monarchy's identity. Her pain had humanized an institution once thought untouchable. To brush that aside, to act as though it had no bearing on the present, felt like a betrayal of the public's memory. Anne, ever the custodian of legacy, couldn't reconcile that contradiction. She didn't hold on to resentment for sport. She held on to it because some wounds never deserved to be bandaged with ceremony and silence. And Camilla, despite her public composure, felt that weight too. She never asked for forgiveness out loud. She never tried to rewrite history with grand speeches or sweeping apologies. Instead, she kept her head down, walked the long road, and allowed time to dull the edges. But time, as Anne so clearly reminded her, doesn't erase. It only delays the reckoning. Camilla carried that guilt. Quietly. Internally. It haunted her not because of the headlines, but because she knew there were those within the walls of the palace who would never see her as anything more than what she once was. And while the public had largely moved on, the palace had not. There was a gap between what people were willing to accept and what the family was willing to forget. Camilla had crossed that divide on paper, in title, in function. But emotionally, spiritually, she remained a question mark in a system obsessed with order. And then came the emotional leak, a detail Camilla couldn't keep to herself. When designers start leaking dinner conversations, you know the crown is cracking. It didn't come from a royal aide, a palace press release, or even a disgruntled former staffer. No, it came from David Emanuel, the very man who once dressed Diana in the most iconic wedding gown the monarchy had ever seen. A man intimately connected to royal history. And yet this time, his role wasn't to stitch fabric, it was to unravel secrets. In an unexpected twist, Emanuel revealed that Camilla had privately confided in him following that now infamous dinner with Charles and Anne. And what she said echoed the chill that had gripped the palace. "You're not a queen, just the king's wife." A phrase she couldn't forget. A line that Anne had delivered with surgical precision. And one that Camilla, in all her years of rising above scandal, simply couldn't shake. The revelation, once leaked, ignited the very blaze the royals had tried so hard to extinguish. Public discourse reignited instantly. Was this a moment of vulnerability from a queen consort still haunted by her place in history? Or was it a calculated whisper, intentionally shared with someone who would make sure it was heard? In the world of royalty, nothing is ever just a slip of the tongue. Every word has consequences. Every leak has a motive. And suddenly, the entire nation was questioning whether Camilla had bared her soul or set the stage for a narrative of victimhood. The media pounced. Headlines splashed across morning tabloids and evening panels dissected the phrase as though it were a constitutional crisis. Just the king's wife became more than a quote. It became a symbol. A symbol of unresolved rivalry, of phantom queens past, and of a monarchy that still couldn't quite outrun its ghosts. Some saw Camilla as sympathetic, a woman still battling whispers of a legacy not entirely hers. Others viewed the leak with suspicion, seeing it as a subtle PR maneuver to reframe public opinion and cast Anne as cold and unyielding. But one thing was certain. This wasn't a harmless confession. It was a crack in the facade, a reminder that behind every perfectly posed photo, behind every royal wave and diplomatic smile, was a storm of history, tension, and identities still struggling to coexist. If even designers were now holding royal secrets in their hands, then what other truths were waiting to slip through the cracks? But this royal tension runs deeper back to when Camilla and Anne were connected through more than just Charles. Before, there was a king, there was a man who linked them both, Andrew Parker Bowles, a name that now fades behind titles and tiaras, but one that once stood at the center of a quiet royal entanglement. Long before Charles and Camilla's controversial love story made headlines, it was Andrew who had ties to both women. And that detail buried in polite conversations and obscured by royal discretion holds far more weight than the public has ever fully grasped. Because before Camilla became the king's wife, and long before Anne carved her legacy into the monarchy's steel frame, both women had one man in common, and that man's place in their lives planted the seeds of tension that never quite stopped growing. Whispers about Anne and Andrew began early. Young, spirited, and fiercely independent, Anne was drawn to Andrew's charm and confidence. Theirs wasn't a public love affair, it was guarded, shrouded in the layers of aristocratic discretion. But the bond was real, undeniable. In another life, it might have gone further. But the rules of royalty don't always bend for emotion. Instead, Andrew married someone else, Camilla. And just like that, a subtle but permanent line was drawn. Not one of betrayal, perhaps, but of uncomfortable proximity. The man who might have been Anne's became Camilla's, and though both women moved forward, that shared history remained buried like a dormant fault line beneath a fragile peace. Camilla's marriage to Andrew was far from smooth. Affairs, emotional distance, and the shadow of Charles hovered constantly. Yet, their union produced children, shared memories, and long-standing ties. Even after their divorce, their bond never truly ended. And neither did his presence in Anne's life. Andrew became godfather to Zara Tyndall, Anne's daughter. A gesture that seemed innocent enough on the surface, but beneath it lay a labyrinth of intertwined loyalties. Anne remained close to him even as Camilla moved into Buckingham Palace. The family tree didn't just branch, it tangled. And it's within that tangle that the true weight of their shared past rests. The monarchy may be steeped in tradition, but the personal histories of its members often defy the orderly lines of protocol. For Anne, the sight of Camilla not only wearing the crown, but sitting beside the brother she had defended her entire life, stirred something deeper than disapproval. It wasn't jealousy. It was a collision of memory, of what was and what should never have been. The past didn't just echo, it roared. Because while Camilla had taken her place beside Charles, she had once stood where Anne might have stood, not just in love, but in life. This overlapping history wasn't a scandal. It was a wound, carefully wrapped in decades of formality, but never fully healed. And perhaps it explains why Anne's restraint snapped that night. Why did her correction carry such emotional precision? Why, despite years of royal professionalism, she couldn't let that title slip by unchallenged? Still, even in private fury, Camilla has a strategy. She retreats into silence. She smiles in public, but the storm always brews in silence. Camilla has spent a lifetime learning how to disappear in plain sight. No matter how loud the whispers, how sharp the headlines, how heavy the stares, she kept her chin up and her words few. Emotional restraint wasn't just survival. It was a requirement. Because every time she stepped into the public eye, she carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations. Some saw her as the woman who broke the fairy tale. Others saw her as a threat to legacy. And despite the carefully crafted image of calm royalty, behind that poise was a woman who had learned how to endure, and not always by choice. In silence, Camilla found control. The louder the criticism grew, the quieter she became. It was her shield. When fingers pointed in the aftermath of Diana's death, when the public's grief turned to blame, when every magazine cover branded her the villain, Camilla didn't fight back. She didn't plead her case or demand understanding. She simply waited. Behind palace walls, beyond the reach of cameras, she endured it all. Because she knows once you are cast as the other woman, even time struggles to change the script. And she also knew the monarchy had no room for messy emotions. It had rules. It had masks. It had protocols designed not to comfort, but to contain. So, Camilla became fluent in the language of restraint. She laughed when appropriate, stood still when expected, and vanished when necessary. But that kind of silence comes with a cost. The toll of carrying blame not just for a broken marriage, but for the heartbreak of a nation never leaves. Every cold glance, every murmured disapproval, every side-by-side comparison to Diana, it all carved itself into her. And yet, she showed up, again and again, determined not to be defined by what she once was, but never allowed to forget it either. But it was Anne's rejection that cut differently. This wasn't the public. This wasn't pressed. This was family. And in that, there was no hiding. No wall of silence could soften the sting of being dismissed not just as queen, but as a woman who didn't belong. Camilla felt it in her bones, and still she didn't lash out. She folded the hurt into the quiet and went on, because silence had always been her safest weapon and her loneliest burden. But as Charles's health declines, the weight of these tensions grows heavier and the crown hangs looser than ever. As the king weakens, the power struggles grow stronger, and Anne may not be finished. Behind palace gates, something far more fragile than glass and gold is starting to fracture: stability. In recent months, whispers surrounding King Charles's health have grown louder, more urgent, more alarming. What began as hushed concern is now turning into a quiet dread among senior royals. He is still standing, still waving, still speaking, but the vigor is fading. And in a family where strength has always been equated with power, any sign of weakness invites more than sympathy. It invites strategy. The monarchy is an institution, but it's also a battlefield of silent ambitions. As Charles struggles against the private toll of illness, the question of succession doesn't just linger, it sharpens. Who will hold the moral compass? Who will shape the future? And more importantly, who will be trusted to preserve the legacy the Queen spent 70 years building? These are no longer distant questions. They are becoming urgent, whispered in corridors and calculated behind closed doors. The weight of the crown is growing heavier, and all eyes are shifting toward the inevitable. And there, standing just slightly in the background, but more commanding than ever, is Anne. She's never been one to chase the spotlight, but now she doesn't need to. Her actions speak louder. Her presence at private meetings, her sudden influence over ceremonial decisions, and her quiet, firm stance in family gatherings have turned heads. With Charles physically diminished and William strategically silent, Anne has begun filling the void not by force, but by default. Her authority is rising, not because it was seized, but because no one else seems capable of bearing it with such clarity. Meanwhile, Camilla finds herself more alone than ever. The camaraderie that once buffered her role is thinning. Public support that once warmed her reception now feels tepid. Even within the family, her presence is less assured. The emotional isolation she's long concealed has begun to press in. Without Charles at full strength, her legitimacy weakens not officially, but symbolically. And in royal dynamics, symbols often matter more than facts. Anne, on the other hand, is no longer just the sister. She's becoming the conscience of the crown. And with that rise comes an unspoken warning. The past may no longer be overlooked, and compromises once tolerated may now be challenged. The confrontation at that dinner might have been the first strike, but it will not be the last. Because Anne is not acting from ego, she's acting from memory, from promises once made, and from truths that were never meant to be rewritten. Her loyalty is not to individuals. It is to the institution and to a mother's legacy she refuses to let fade. Because behind every crown is a storm, and Anne just might be the one holding back the thunder. Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next one.